So, as Francesca just mentioned, and as the title of my talk alludes to, in the next 16 or so minutes, I'm going to be delving into topics related to grief and terminal illness. So if that is at all sensitive to anyone, then I just want to make you all aware of that. But hopefully in me just telling this story, I can create a safe space in which to share these various experiences and the struggles and grievances that come with losing someone, as is a very human experience. And I hope to impart at least a semblance of comfort in relation to that. But before I begin, I'd just like to introduce you all to someone very, very near to my heart, someone I hold very dear to me. This is a photo of my dad and me in the Caribbean, on one of the isles where my parents first met. My mom is actually sitting in the audience today. She took this on their 15th anniversary, and I thought it would be a fitting accompaniment for what I'm about to tell you. Because as you can see, I'm doing my very best to truly capture my dad in this photo, and I can only hope to translate those skills into verbal form for you today. Though I'll admit, I struggle to formulate a story that would express precisely what I wish to say about him. And I'm sure that you can understand words don't often quite amount to the extent of our feelings. And yet, here I stand in an attempt to make sense of it all. My dad is turning 80 in 2 weeks, so he's lived almost a whole life, most of which I haven't been a part of. And I often wonder what my dad has experienced in all those years that I'll never know about, things that he hasn't already told me. Moments of the past, now fragments of memory, such like the evanescence of a dream soon to be forgotten. Aging is the thing that we all have in common. It's happening every day, all the time. The older we get, the more distant we feel to the selves that we were yesterday. But in many ways, our identity is based on the sum of our memories. What we remember shapes who we are, or at least who we think we are. 400 years ago, the empiricist philosopher John Locke argued that selfhood consists entirely on the continuity of memory. And it makes sense. Our memory is a record of all that has happened to us throughout the course of our life. We behave the way that we do because of our memories. They are stored in a web of associations in the brain so that whenever we encounter something new, our interpretation of that is filtered by what we already know. Memory thereby determines how we think and how we feel. It quite literally molds the self. And that is why Descartes' famous postulation, "I think, therefore I am," might even be modified as "I remember, therefore I am." But although the self is contingent on memory, part of who we are is also defined by the ways in which we relate to people. I think of all the many relationships that influence our own development as individuals, the most influential and perhaps most formative is the one between parent and child. I've learned a lot through my dad, I think even more than I would have had he been younger, had there been more time. But I also feel robbed, because I have questions of endless multitude and inquiries about all the things that have made my dad into the person that he is. And you might think all I would need to do is simply just ask. But the trouble is that my dad isn't quite my dad anymore. Not that long ago, he asked my mom if she was married. And he then went on to ask where the man who they both share a bed with at night had disappeared to. This man, a fragment of fiction conjured by his own distortions, affirms how we don't live in the same reality anymore. It is symptomatic of something fundamentally more seismic than mere aging. That is what sets dementia apart from any other terminal disease. Because I am grieving someone that is still here in flesh and bone, but gone in every other sense of the word. 2 summers ago, I was in Italy teaching yoga at a hotel just a couple hours north of Venice, in the foothills of the Italian Alps. I was going to be there a total of 3 months, and in that time, my mom had decided to come and visit me. In the days leading up to her departure, I, like many of us, got COVID for the first time. And I was the sickest I'd ever been. It was debilitating and unendurable, and I just needed my mom. She had left my dad home alone before, but never overnight. Never for days at a time. This time he wasn't gonna be alone though, because my younger brother was gonna stay with him. And my mom had also booked domestic services 5 times a day, which is where someone would come to the house to administer medicine, but also prepare food and just check in with my dad to make sure everything was okay. My mom wasn't gonna be gone for very long at all, and she felt confident in the precautionary measures made. She arrived very late that night, and this was also at a time when the pandemic had started to resurface, so travel was hectic and exhausted enough as it was. When she arrived at the airport, she rented a car and started down the mayhem that is the Italian highway. The winding roads that paved her way up that mountain were a foreshadowing of what came next. Because my mom was not gone even 24 hours before everything had started to fall apart. The following morning, she woke to a string of messages from my younger brother, who had been up all night, petrified and sleepless. Earlier that morning, around 1 o'clock, several people had appeared outside of her house back home and were trying to come inside. "Open the fucking door," they said. And my brother, scared stiff, refused to yield to their demands. He thought they were trying to break in. They left eventually, but my brother was unmoving. When my mom got off the phone to him that morning, she booked a flight back immediately. It turns out that my dad had been fiddling with the alarm attached to his wristwatch, and that the people outside were actually the night patrol. And the reason they wanted to get inside so badly was because they thought my dad was perilously hurt, that he'd slipped and fallen, or worse. But he was fine. I don't think my dad was even aware of what was happening at the time. But it was my brother who was left deeply traumatized by the whole of it. Never in a million years could my mom have predicted that something like that would have happened. And yet, she was overcome by guilt at having left my 18-year-old brother alone with my dad, who had suddenly become this liability. And she was angry with my dad for making her choose between my brother and I. But what could she do? What could any of us really do? Because my dad was blameless. He was always blameless. The reverberations of that summer still echo beneath our feet, because it marked the degeneration of my dad as we knew him, and the changing nature of our relationship. It was our turning point. As his concept of self began to chip away, as did his identity. And something vital to the foundation of our relation had severed. He was no longer a husband or a father. He was now our patient. There is a standing thought experiment among philosophers that illustrates this quite well, referred to as the Theseus paradox. You may have heard of it. According to legend, when Theseus first discovered Athens and rescued those enslaved by King Minos, he escaped onto his ship. And each year after that, the Athenians would commemorate this heroic deed through a pilgrimage. The ship of Theseus sailed between all the corners of the earth, wherein each individual part inevitably decayed and was either lost or replaced, evoking the most palpable question of things that grow and age. When we return to harbor from the journey that is our life, have we remained the same, or are we fundamentally different? How many pieces of my dad have survived these stormy seas? And how long until he is entirely not my dad anymore? In our best efforts to ease his discomfort and avoid exacerbating any further confusion, we often find ourselves lying to him or disguising the truth. It can be about the littlest thing, and yet every time it feels like we are pulled further apart, like we lose another piece of the ship. But sometimes it is just easier than having to correct him, because we are all just striving towards his equilibrium, trying to keep the waters at bay. That summer in Italy, it was the mast. We lost the whole mast, and with it the sail that gave us a sense of direction, that propelled us forward. Ships are built for the winds, but this one is stagnant and barely afloat. My dad is sinking, and I never even got the chance to truly know him. Alzheimer's affects everyone differently. It's nearly impossible to predict how, and even more difficult to remedy. In fact, the first person diagnosed with Alzheimer's, nearly 118 years ago, likely received the same treatment as my dad now does. He is prescribed medication that has since been developed, but this only tempers the symptoms, slowing the progression of the disease. And the non-drug treatments involve constant caregiving and the implementation of a lot of routine just to cultivate that sense of stability. You are constantly asked a million different questions, and sometimes the same question a million different times. It's likely to make just about anyone go insane. My dad now lives in a permanent care facility, removed from all of us. My mom, my brother, and I. But we three remain his tether to reality. Part of who we are is certainly the sum of our parts. But I believe that we're so much more than merely that. Our constitution does not determine, nor does it equate to our sole identity. There's a German postmodern philosopher by the name of Martin Heidegger, who once said that, "Not only am I changed by my relationship to another person, I find my own identity neither in myself nor in the other, but in the relationship itself." With our eyes on the horizon, the oceans can seem like a formidable reminder of our own cosmic insignificance. But I think relationships are what fortify our sense of self. They are what give us a sense of direction. They are what propel us forward. They are what keep us afloat. It is because of you that I know I exist. Because identity is intersubjective, not individualistic. I looked for the picture that I took of my dad on this day because I thought it would have been the perfect way for me to end. Something to show you for what I have just told. A true full circle moment. But I don't think that I ever actually took the picture. Images are meant to make visible that which is not. And I think the fact that I never took this picture is symbolic of my loss and a measure of my own grief. Because this person that you see up on the screen also doesn't quite exist. Not anymore. And perhaps images too don't quite amount to the extent of our feelings. And maybe this image needed to be seen in the mind of a listener. I know it might sound pretentious, but maybe this stage is my camera, and here is where I was finally meant to take that picture. And although the image I'm referring to was never tangibly archived, such as this one, in telling the story, I'm able to capture my dad in memory, which is where he will now live on. And it is in the distillation of my dad's various relationships from which his own identity springs. He may not be my dad anymore in the way that I remember, or in the way that I want him to be. But I will always be his daughter, regardless of whether he forgets that. And in so being, I can preserve his identity. Because through loving him, he continues to be my loved one. Thank you.